Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Global Hydrogen Interview Series. And I'm delighted today to be joined by His Excellency Sharif Al Olama, Undersecretary at the UAE Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure for Energy and Petroleum Affairs. Your Excellency, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Diala. The pleasure is all mine.
Thank you. Well, we've been digging deeply into the hydrogen story for the last year or two. It has certainly the momentum on it has taken off both in the region and internationally in terms of commitment of funds and interest and discussion. And of course, the Gulf is no exception, and neither is the UAE on that front. In fact, the UAE was one of the first movers in the region to develop or start a hydrogen industry, and it has since made quite a few investments and continues to do so in terms of partnership and reach as well. So a lot of progress made so far, both in financial commitment and time. What would you say would be a hurdle that currently exists on that journey for hydrogen in the UAE and in the region?
That's a very good question, Diala. Let me start off by just, maybe giving a little bit of a brief in terms of what's involved when we talk about instilling a hydrogen revolution, as you might call it. Just like the Industrial Revolution, it's a fact, as they say, no pain, no gain. And the hydrogen revolution, industrial revolution, is no different. Hydrogen, we see, will be one of the main pillars that will help the majority of the countries to achieve their net zero targets. As you're aware, there is a majority of countries around the globe that have pledged to achieving net zero, most of them targeting approximately the year 2050. We in the UAE are very proud that we were one of the first countries in the region, in the MENA region, to announce our strategic initiative of achieving net zero by 2050. Energy transition journey is not expected to be an easy ride. We are actually witnessing that today through all the situation that we see when it comes to adopting green hydrogen, adopting clean fuels compared to fossil fuels, and what the world is seeing today. There are many hurdles that are yet to overcome so that hydrogen can actually compete with your conventional sources of energy or fuel. I see that there are three major obstacles in the way of implementing a clean hydrogen economy. Namely, first is the elevated cost of production when it comes to hydrogen. Second, the lack of an existing supply value chain. And third, and very important, is the dire need for regulations, policies, and international standards.
Okay,
a lot of work is... Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just address one of those? They're all relevant, but the third one you just mentioned, which was regulation. And in the Gulf, and that is across the board, people would agree that it requires a lot of progress before, well, at least to aid this hydrogen story to lift off even faster. One of the challenges here in the Gulf is that the energy sector is heavily regulated because it is a core obviously sector for the region. That is changing. There is some dynamics there, but do you think that the regulation is moving fast enough in tandem with the fact that the technology is advancing very fast? But what remains on the regulatory front, do you think, in the region that could be done at this stage?
Very good point, Diala. Like I said, one of the most important enablers to establish a hydrogen economy is the need for policies and a regulatory framework. Here I have to highlight that the pace and drive and commitment to the energy transition will vary from country to country, as each country has its own priorities when it comes to economy and growth. However important the climate factor is, each country will work at its own pace and strength when it comes to transitioning to clean energy. And therefore, you're going to see a variety of progress when it comes to policies and regulations in different countries and different regions. Here in the UAE, I'm very proud to say that work has already started with regards to the development of a hydrogen policy and regulatory framework. I have to thank the Abu Dhabi Department of Energy that has taken the first steps in terms of developing a framework, a regulatory framework. And they are currently in the process of aligning all the major stakeholders in our capital, Abu Dhabi, as well as the ministry. We anticipate that the final report for the work that the Department of Energy is doing should be available towards the end of this year. It will define policies, regulations, standards, and certification requirements, which we eventually in the ministry will pave the way forward regarding what is required on a federal level.
Okay, and you mentioned the cost as one of the points, one of the hurdles as well, cost, supply chain, supply value chain, and regulation. Cost, of course, particularly in this industry, but in many, in the energy sector is, it's related to scale, right? The more you scale up, the more your economies of scale get better. Of course, to get to scale, you need to invest in the technology and find that route. That has been a main sticking point in the hydrogen sector. We must start doing even pilot projects at scale. Again, where would you see that dynamic shifting significantly in any way going forward?
Yeah. If we go with the economy of scale, as we move into large-scale hydrogen production, this eventually will help bringing the cost down. The more hydrogen is produced, the more electrolyzers, for example, will be required. We anticipate that the number of electrolyzers that are required over the next 8 years in order to hit some of the targets that have been identified, for example, in Europe, would be around 100-fold. So once that happens, we anticipate that there will be some improvement in terms of the cost of producing hydrogen. Of course, there is another aspect, Diala, that we need to take into consideration, and that is investments. There is a lot of investment that is required in the infrastructure and the storage, transportation, and distribution. There are other factors that are related to safety considerations. These have to be taken into account, especially when you look into using hydrogen as a source of energy. And then, of course, there is a very important part that is matching both your supply and demand uncertainties. So when it comes to the cost factor, I think there is a number of enablers that we really need to meet. You need to look into the cost of renewable energies and desalination cost. These have to be viable to make the cost of hydrogen viable. We need to have significant improvement in terms of storage for generated electricity. The storing of hydrogen also needs to be looked at and improved, keeping in mind that hydrogen is also too volatile. And finally, of course, we need to create the demand. There has to be an offtake. So industry demand needs to be created, especially for green hydrogen, which right now is not there to the extent that we are really anticipating it should be.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, let's talk. And as you said, certainly the renewable story, though, has been very successful in the Gulf in terms of getting costs down. So it's well on its way. And as you said, we need scale on that front, and storage, more importantly, even of renewables, which feeds into the green hydrogen solution. But you mentioned demand, and I wanted to ask you and talk to you about the strategy for the UAE and the Gulf in terms of its long-term strategy of where this hydrogen goes. You need to create demand, you need the demand security for the investment to happen. A lot of talk has centered around creating local demand, and we'll talk about the export angle after that. But the UAE particularly is now on a new drive. One of its recent drives is to expand its industrial and manufacturing base. It already has a very, very successful aluminium industry. But again, where do you see the balance of where this hydrogen will eventually go? Is it going to be catering to local, hard to abate industries, or for export to Europe?
Yes. A very good question, Diana. I'll make reference to COP26 in Glasgow when Her Excellency Mariam Al-Mehri actually launched the hydrogen leadership roadmap that we as a country, as the UAE, launched. And that leadership roadmap really put in the framework of what we are trying to do here in the UAE. We are going to be addressing our domestic needs, but at the same time, we are also targeting the export markets. We have also identified a number of export markets that we will give the priority to. Germany, India, Japan, and South Korea have been earmarked as high potential markets where there is a dire need for hydrogen. Now, hydrogen, when you look at it, it has been in use for the past many decades in refineries, fertilizers, steel industries, and many other industries. Where we see the significant contribution that it can make towards our clean energy transition goals is we need to introduce it, like you said, into sectors that they are almost completely absent. Some of these sectors, which I want to mention over here, are transport, buildings, and power generation. I think, like you said, the transportation sector, we have identified it in our energy strategy, the Energy 2050 strategy, as one of the main areas that we really need to decarbonize and address the emissions. So introducing hydrogen into the transportation sector has its challenges, but it is one of the targets that we have in the country. The other aspect, like you mentioned, is the aluminum industry and the steel industry, where hydrogen is of use. And we are also currently discussing with these industries, which we have in the UAE, of how we can utilize either it being blue or green hydrogen for their processes.
Okay, and I mean, you mentioned blue and green right at the end of your answer there. How much thought goes into whether the UAE wants to focus its attention? Obviously, blue, you have the natural advantage of having the gas, it's there. Renewables, again, as I said, very, very great success story in the UAE so far, but you know, obviously not there yet in scale to be able to feed into hydrogen at the scale that we want. But again, in terms of the cost competitiveness of green versus blue, and where that trajectory is going, as you know, in the next decade, and should we be focusing on one more than the other in terms of investment?
That's one of the key topics of discussion that I've consistently had with my counterparts in our international cooperation with different countries. You have two, as you might say, two parties or two groups. There are the hardcore climate supporters that are only keen on using green hydrogen, while there are others that are open to other colors of hydrogen. And we in the UAE obviously are blessed with natural resources. We have natural gas that we cannot simply overlook. My personal opinion is there will be a need for all, but the question is how quick can each of them come into the picture? So when we talk about, for example, blue hydrogen today, natural gas in terms of prices is very competitive when it comes to looking at natural gas costs in the Middle East or in the MENA region. So it just makes sense that, you know, the blue hydrogen should be one of the hydrogen sources that we need to take into consideration. This can be a phase where it can actually eventually lead into producing green hydrogen. Mm-hmm. As you produce blue hydrogen, as there are investments made in this realm, as there are, you know, electrolyzers produced, as technology develops, all of this will lead to a drop in the cost of producing green hydrogen. So for me, it is really a transition, just like what we talk about energy transition going from fossil fuels to clean energy. It will be the same exactly for hydrogen. You will start off with blue, from my perspective, and you will eventually lead into green when it becomes affordable, when it becomes cost competitive.
And of course, Europe is very much in favor of green and considering its taxonomy and its agenda there. But let's talk a bit about, and you're just saying it depends on a point of view and not one size fits all. Every country will move at its own pace. But when it comes to exports and infrastructure, does the UAE really have a definitive ambition to become a true hydrogen hub? For export and from an infrastructure point of view, can it do that? And does it face any serious competition? I mean, where do you see in the region, and we can go beyond the Gulf, where is there room for everybody to do that?
Okay, let's look at it from a pragmatic view. Hydrogen is emerging as a tremendous opportunity globally. For the Middle East, I believe that hydrogen will be a new sustainable industry that we can add to our hydrocarbon wealth. There is a study that we've seen which actually identifies that the GCC and the MENA region could produce up to around 200 million tons of hydrogen by the year 2050. This, of course, number is not cast in stone. It has a lot of factors. So, how quick technology develops, how do the policies develop in terms of enticing the production of green hydrogen. All of that will play a factor in terms of the amount of hydrogen that will be produced by the year 2050. Now, in the UAE, we have a number of prevailing factors, and we are blessed with this. These are competitive advantages that we have. These will help us, I believe, in terms of becoming a regional and international hub for hydrogen production. First, of course, is the geographic location. When you look at the UAE, we have the unique opportunity to serve trade between East and West. Another, of course, is that we in the UAE are blessed with a lot of sun. And we have heavily invested and deployed renewable energy in the UAE. And we have driven the cost significantly down when you compare it with other parts of the globe. So these advantages, I believe, give the UAE and to a certain extent other countries in the GCC region some sort of advantage when it comes to hydrogen. We have of course, like I mentioned earlier, our demand, our domestic demand that we need to address. But I believe also a big portion of the hydrogen that will be produced eventually in the UAE and in the GCC will be earmarked for export to countries like, let's say, Europe, who we know that in terms of emissions are one of the biggest emitters because of all the industries over there. And their emissions go beyond their borders. And that is where they need the support and this global collaboration in terms of hydrogen and other sources of clean fuel.
And of course, their demand, as their regulations get stricter on carbon emissions, obviously their demand will increase for cleaner fuels. And let's just talk a little bit about Europe there in terms of partnerships. There's been a lot of investment done by UAE and Saudi Arabia, again, on this front. Who would you identify would be the natural partners in Europe on this hydrogen journey? Is it technology companies or is it securing them as consumers? I mean, going forward, where would you go beyond where the UAE has gone already in terms of securing those strategic partnerships?
Yeah, the fact, Diala, is international multilateral cooperation is needed to realize really the benefits of going globally with regards to hydrogen deployment. There is no one country or one company that can do it all. Global problems basically need global solutions. Like I said, we are operating in a very complex ecosystem. It requires the supply chains along with the main players to all act together.
Okay, and I mean, I would take up the point that as we begin to wrap up the interview, just in the UAE, of course, is also hosting COP28 next year, which is fantastic. And of course, that's going to put it even more front and center in terms of what it's doing towards obviously the energy transition and climate control, climate change control. And let me just give you, I'd like to ask you a more sort of general overarching question. We're talking about partnerships, we're talking about global cooperation. This question over emissions trading schemes, carbon pricing, you know, a lot of criticism around the world saying, why can't the world get its act together and agree on a carbon price? And without that, none of these initiatives could work, whether it's investing in hydrogen or any other cleaner fuels. Let's get your point of view on the progress on this carbon price. Is it important that we have more global agreement on that, or is it okay for national policies to follow what they can when they're ready?
I think it is the latter, Diala, because introducing carbon pricing and taxation would have a different impact when you look at it from a European country versus, say, countries that are in Africa. At the end of the day, what are we driving at? We are driving at getting to a source of energy that is accessible for all and that is affordable by all. So, like I said, different countries have different priorities and different countries have also different capabilities. So it's not a straightforward answer if you want me to say that, but I think it depends on the country, it depends on the region, and it's going to be a transition. I don't think you can do it in one go. We did some sort of very high level analysis in terms of, you know, if there is a sort of carbon tax that is introduced, how would that impact, for example, if you apply it on natural gas, and what would that give you in terms of cost of electricity production? And compare that with the costs that we are seeing today of hydrogen. Still, there is no comparison. And I'm not taking into account the current hikes that we are seeing in terms of gas prices. This is, of course, a one-off because of a certain situation that we are seeing globally. But once the prices of gas go back to normal, there is still a gap between what kind of costs we're talking about of power generation or energy generation from hydrogen compared to your natural fossil fuels, even if you look into a taxation scheme related to emissions.
Okay, but we'll get there in the end, I suppose, and that comes back to scale and facing these solutions. Your Excellency, Sharif Al Olama, thank you so much for joining us today on the Global Hydrogen Interview Series. Thank you for your time and your insights.
Always a pleasure, Diana.